What was meant to be a brief 12-minute conversation became something entirely different. There was no live audience, no cheering crowd, just two individuals separated by screens and united by tension. Within moments, a pointed remark from the interviewer would transform this remote discussion into one of the most intense exchanges viewers had witnessed in recent memory. When the broadcast concluded, only one participant would remain on screen, and it wouldn't be the one with royal lineage. The broadcast indicator glowed steadily. In the main studio, the veteran journalist positioned himself behind his desk, posture confident, expression carefully neutral, yet attentive. The metropolitan skyline behind him provided an understated backdrop, seemingly indifferent to the drama about to unfold. On the large display opposite appeared his guest, a former member of one of the world's most famous families. The background was deliberately minimal. Soft, neutral tones, carefully positioned books, a meaningful keepsake visible on a nearby shelf. He wore a dark blazer over an open collared shirt, relaxed, measured, perhaps even dismissive. "Thank you for being here tonight," the host began evenly. A single nod in response. No pleasantries, no small talk exchanged. "Let's dive right in," the interviewer continued. "You've shared your perspective extensively about family dynamics, media treatment, and what you describe as persistent targeting. Some viewers feel this ground has been covered before. What makes tonight's conversation different?" His guest's expression tightened immediately. "Because reality doesn't have an expiration date simply because it's inconvenient for some people to keep hearing it." A ripple of tension passed through the production booth. The host remained unfazed. "That's a fair point," he acknowledged calmly, though others might suggest that revisiting identical complaints through various books, interviews, and documentary projects starts resembling a calculated approach rather than genuine expression. A dismissive sound escaped his guest. "That's quite something," he fired back, "especially coming from someone who's constructed an entire profession around targeting me and my partner." The interviewer's eyebrow lifted slightly. "I've offered criticism, certainly, because questioning public figures isn't harassment, it's holding them accountable." His guest reclined in his seat, arms folding defensively. "There it is, that confident certainty of yours. You position yourself as some impartial observer while making your personal animosity perfectly obvious." The host nodded thoughtfully. "I don't harbor animosity toward you. I raise questions. Those are distinct things." A sharp, mirthless laugh came through the screen. "Interesting distinction," came the reply, "because from my perspective, they appear completely identical." The friction was already undeniable, and barely 5 minutes had elapsed. The interviewer adjusted his position slightly, maintaining his measured delivery. "Let's discuss the concept of consequences. You've spoken about psychological well-being, personal struggles, and recovery. Yet every public statement you make creates ripples affecting your relatives, your sibling, your parent. Have you considered whether continuing this public conversation creates more damage than benefit?" His guest's eyes flashed with intensity. "Not for a single moment," he responded sharply. "What creates damage is staying quiet. What creates damage is people like you instructing those who've suffered to simply move forward because their truth makes you uneasy." The host leaned forward almost imperceptibly. "Are you characterizing yourself as someone who's suffered?" The pause that followed felt razor thin. "I'm characterizing myself as someone who endured, and if that troubles you, perhaps examine why." The production booth went completely still. The interviewer exhaled softly before responding. "Endured what specifically? Enormous privilege, substantial wealth, worldwide platforms to share your perspective?" "You have no authority to define my experiences," countered he. "And you cannot deploy them as instruments whenever convenient." The confrontation intensifies. The guest's composure visibly cracked. Whatever thin veneer of politeness remained began dissolving. This is precisely why I was reluctant to participate in this discussion. Your interest isn't in comprehension, your interest is in embarrassment. The interviewer shook his head. My interest is in straight answers, and numerous viewers are curious why those answers consistently arrive alongside another commercial arrangement. His guest pressed forward, eyes blazing toward the camera. You believe this is financially motivated? He demanded. That perspective reveals far more about your character than mine. The interviewer didn't elevate his tone, he didn't cut in, he simply waited. That calculated silence, deliberate and strategic, carried more weight than any verbal jab could have. Eventually, he spoke. Here's something worth considering, he said quietly. At what point does sharing your experience transform into imposing it on others? The guest's lips separated, then pressed firmly together. For the first time since broadcasting began, an immediate response didn't come. The screen connecting them suddenly felt impossibly thin, and everyone watching understood this had evolved beyond a standard interview. This was a direct collision of perspectives, and it was only getting started. The quiet following that last question extended longer than natural. The guest stared into his camera, jaw set firmly, eyes unwavering, refusing to yield ground. At what point does sharing your experience transform into imposing it on others? Finally, he released a sharp breath through his nose. You genuinely don't recognize your own patterns, do you? You construct everything as an assault, as though speaking openly is somehow criminal behavior. The response came instantly. Open expression isn't problematic. Repeating accusations without accepting scrutiny yourself is. Another deliberate, dismissive laugh came through. And there's that word again, scrutiny. You adore that term because it allows you to appear principled while doing what you've always done, undermining anyone who challenges your worldview. The host maintained his composure. I examine claims made by anyone in the public sphere, particularly when those claims reshape institutions, affect reputations, and conveniently coincide with another major media project. His guest moved closer to his camera, shoulders nearly filling the entire frame. You're fixated on us, he said coldly. You've been fixated for years. You've faced professional consequences because of it, haven't you? A collective intake of breath echoed through the control room. The interviewer's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with sharpened focus. I faced professional consequences because I declined to express belief in something I genuinely doubted, and I would make that choice again. His guest smirked. Naturally, you would. Playing the persecuted truth-teller has become your personal specialty. The host tilted his head thoughtfully. Fascinating observation from you. The guest froze, just momentarily. You've leveled accusations against your family, against journalists, even against ordinary citizens, claiming mistreatment. Yet anyone who examines your version of events gets immediately labeled as malicious or problematic. Doesn't that seem remarkably convenient? His guest shook his head slowly. No, it seems remarkably accurate. Does it? Or is it simply easier than addressing difficult questions directly? You don't have the right to determine what's difficult for me to discuss. Yet you expect the public to absorb your difficulties indefinitely. That's the fundamental contradiction here. His guest reclined again, arms crossing tightly against his chest. This perfectly illustrates why public trust in traditional media has collapsed. You provoke deliberately, then claim you're simply pursuing answers. The host raised his hand slightly. I'm not claiming anything beyond asking why your healing process apparently requires constant public platforms. His guest's eyes flashed with renewed intensity. You believe recovery should be silent?
You believe trauma simply evaporates if you stop acknowledging it? No. I believe genuine recovery typically progresses forward. Yours seems permanently anchored here. He tapped his desk surface. Year after year. The atmosphere thickened noticeably. His previous attempts at smiling had completely vanished. You understand nothing about my reality, nothing about experiencing constant scrutiny from your earliest memories. The host leaned forward, voice still controlled. I understand criticism. I understand being challenged publicly. And I understand the distinction between genuine attacks and simple disagreement. His guest shook his head vigorously. You always reduce things this way. You transform lived experience into abstract intellectual.
The host didn't raise his voice. He didn't display satisfaction. I'm interested in clarity, he replied. You confuse those because clarity threatens your preferred version of events. A short, hollow laugh came through the connection. Listen to yourself, he said. You speak as if you're the ultimate authority on suffering and legitimacy. No, the interviewer corrected. I speak as someone exhausted by selective outrage. The guest pressed forward again, this time gripping the chair arm beside him. You cannot comprehend what it requires to walk away from everything familiar, he snapped. From security, from your entire previous existence. The host nodded slowly. And yet, you've capitalized on that departure remarkably effectively. This was the pivotal statement. The guest's expression hardened instantly. Repeat that statement, he demanded. I said, the interviewer repeated calmly, that your departure from your previous life has evolved into a commercial enterprise. The guest erupted. That's absolutely vile, he barked. You sit there, comfortable, self-satisfied, questioning my motivations as if this were entertainment. The host remained unmoved. You sign substantial agreements, he said. Books, productions, audio programs, extensive interviews. You selected public visibility after claiming to abandon it. His guest shook his head violently. We didn't select anything. We were compelled into this position. Then why continuously return to it? The interviewer asked. Why not construct something privately? His guest raised his voice. Because remaining silent protects wrongdoers. The studio lighting seemed to intensify. The host paused briefly before responding. Or, he said carefully, silence protects tranquility. That observation struck hard. The guest's jaw clenched, his breathing became visible. He glanced away again, off camera for an extended moment this time. Muffled voices could be detected through his audio feed, someone speaking urgently in low tones. He returned his attention to the screen, visibly frustrated. This is exactly what I was cautioned about, he said, that you would distort everything. The host leaned back slightly. Cautioned? He asked. By whom, specifically? His guest's eyes burned with intensity. By individuals who genuinely understand your methods. Ah, the interviewer replied with dry humor, that certainly narrows the possibilities. The guest pointed toward his camera. You've constructed an entire profession around attacking people whose experiences you cannot comprehend. No, the interviewer corrected. I challenge people who resist examination. His guest laughed sharply. Examination? You mean antagonism? I mean inquiry, the interviewer said. Something you seem comfortable directing towards institutions, but uncomfortable receiving personally. The guest stood partially from his seat before catching himself, settling back down. His breathing had grown heavier. You believe this represents cleverness, he demanded, trapping me, forcing reactions? The host tilted his head thoughtfully. I believe you arrived expecting sympathy and discovered skepticism instead, and that's what frustrates you. His guest's expression dropped low and dangerous. You have no authority to interrogate my personal struggles. I'm not interrogating your struggles. I'm interrogating your consistency. The guest snapped back. There's that word again. Consistency, as though human pain follows predictable patterns. Pain doesn't, the host agreed, but credibility does. That was the breaking point. The guest slammed his hand down somewhere off frame, the movement causing his camera to shake slightly. I refuse to remain here being analyzed by someone who's built a profession attacking my partner and my family, he shouted, voice elevated significantly. The host remained seated. I critique behavior, he said, not relationships. His guest pointed directly at the screen. You've disrespected us for years. I've challenged inconsistencies, the interviewer corrected. There's an important distinction. His complexion flushed. You do not possess the authority to determine that. No, the host replied. The public does. The guest froze. For a brief instant, something vulnerable crossed his features. Not anger, not arrogance, something resembling fear, the dawning recognition that events weren't unfolding according to expectation. You know what, he said suddenly, this is exactly the harmful environment I departed from. The host nodded slowly. Then departing again should feel familiar. Audible gasps filled the studio. His guest stared at him, stunned by the directness. You're unbelievable, he said. I'm consistent, the interviewer replied. His guest shook his head, disbelief transforming into fury. You want the final statement, he said. You always require it. The host leaned back, hands still folded. No, he said softly. I want honesty. His guest laughed a sharp, empty sound. Enjoy your version of honesty, he said. I'm finished here. He reached forward, hand hovering near something beyond the frame. The interviewer spoke one final time. Before you disconnect, he said calmly, ask yourself this. If everyone who questions you is cool, perhaps the problem isn't the questioning. The guest stopped. His hand froze mid-motion. The words landed like a slow detonation. His voice dropped, trembling slightly. You don't get to define me. The host met his gaze directly. You already accomplished that yourself tonight. His jaw trembled visibly. Then, without additional words, the screen went black. The connection severed. No gradual fade, no farewell, just sudden absence. The studio sat in stunned stillness. The host looked into his camera, exhaled once, and spoke. Well, he said quietly, that communicates everything. The production team erupted, not in celebration, but in astonished murmurs. Social media platforms exploded within seconds. Guest terminates interview live. Unfiltered moment when questions became too direct. Walkout during broadcast after intense exchange. The host didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply organized his papers. We'll pause briefly, and when we return, we'll discuss why accountability registers as assault to those unaccustomed to experiencing it. The camera pulled back, lighting dimmed, and somewhere beyond the studio, his former guest sat staring at a blank monitor, recognizing belatedly that walking away doesn't always conclude the conversation. Sometimes it becomes the headline.